Hello and welcome to a new edition of TeachTalk. Today I'm talking to Dr. Suda Perera at the University of Sussex in the UK, where she's my colleague in the Department of International Development. Hi Suda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi Anka.
My first question is, so what's your background and where, who, and what do you teach?
Great. So my name's Dr. Suda Perera, and I am currently a lecturer in international development at the University of Sussex. My background is that I trained as a conflict analyst, both in a kind of practitioner sense. So I've worked in the African Great Lakes, primarily in Rwanda and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where I specialize in the disarmament, demobilization and reintegration of soldiers in the armed groups in the African Great Lakes. I wrote my PhD on that, and then I sort of moved into practice-based academia, working alongside policymakers and practitioners to do action-led research in conflict zones. And then after having children and not being able to spend time in conflict zones, I sort of transitioned into perhaps more traditional academia in terms of teaching. And now I teach at Sussex, and I teach courses on gender and violence and conflict from a decolonial perspective.
Brilliant. So in terms of your teaching, what does this idea of critical creative pedagogy, which is kind of at the heart of the Creative Universities project, what does it mean to you and how does it relate to your own pedagogic practice?
Great, thanks. So I think one of the things that really attracted me to teaching at Sussex, and particularly at international development at Sussex, is this kind of ethos of critical hope that you guys have. And I think that's something, it's always been quite hard to get the balance, you know, in my kind of background as a practitioner and working with practitioners. People are very hopeful because they need to be, and they need to believe in the good that they're doing, and they sometimes push ahead with things because they think it's better than nothing. And then when you come to academia, people are incredibly critical because they see all the kind of structural problems and the practice problems that underpin a lot of development work. And I think for me, I'm trying to get a balance between these two things. When we're teaching students, a lot of them want to go and work in the development industry, and they're motivated by this overwhelming desire to do good, to act in solidarity. And it can be quite disheartening when they hear about all the horrors of the development industry, its colonial nature and all those kinds of things. But what I try and do is sort of push this idea that we can do better, and that by critically engaging with the problems, that's the only way we can try and solve those problems or work towards making those problems maybe less problematic. So for me, this kind of critical creativity is, yes, pointing out, you know, where we've gone wrong, but also thinking of creative ways to address those problems. And I think as academics, because we want to point out what is wrong, you know, in the everyday practice, in the structures, in all kinds of discourses around this, we kind of take a lot of the hope out, which can be quite demoralizing and demoralizing for students as well. But actually, if we look back, I mean, I'm just thinking about when I was an undergraduate and the way that I was learning about the world and, you know, development. I didn't really do development studies as such. It was a kind of part of politics and international relations where I studied development. We were learning about it in incredibly problematic ways. We were, you know, really pushing forward the kind of white savior complexes. There were none of these discussions about power relations and coloniality that are integral to the courses we're learning and teaching now. And I think we do need to look at how far we've come, as well as saying, you know, don't rest on our laurels, things can be better.
I think it's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, in your own classrooms, Can you give us some ideas of your creative teaching practices and how students are learning from them?
Yeah, so the way that I like to think about it is I like to think of equipping students with toolkits. And I kind of say, you know, we can be critical and we can point out these problems, but then, you know, so what? Kind of what is it that you achieve by pointing out these problems? So I think pointing out these problems is really important, but having a good vocabulary with which to articulate these problems, to be able to show other people that these problems have kind of deep roots that are structural, and to show how they manifest on different levels, at the global level, the societal level, and then at the individual level. All of this is really important in kind of affecting change. So what I try and do in the classroom is really get students to understand these different levels of analysis and think about how they can talk about it to people who might not have done these courses. How they can talk about it to friends and family at home, how they might be able to challenge and bring this up in the workplace when they're working in development settings. And that's really what I see as kind of the core of what I'm trying to teach people. I'm not trying to teach them that anything is particularly right or wrong, but I'm getting them to analyze a problem through these lenses and to think of the bigger picture. So that's really where I think the creativity comes in, is to zoom out and see what is the bigger picture and what do individual actions or individual interventions mean for those bigger pictures.
That's really interesting. And what you said about in terms of also taking it out of the classroom to talk to family and friends and the workplace. Now, I know you do a lot of teaching in relation to gender, and I know one of the your activities is something called the River of Life, where you get students to kind of reflect on their own journeys. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, at the core of everything I teach, I really believe this sort of personal is political. And, you know, we come to these subjects, none of us, you know, particularly myself, come to these subjects from a kind of neutral, dispassionate, uninvested position. You know, we come to learn about these subjects because they are personally interesting to us. But that obviously then shapes what we feel is interesting, you know, what motivates us to learn, what we want to do with that knowledge. And I try at the very beginning to get students really to reflect on that. And I do it myself, you know, I show them how I do it, the background that I came from, some of the ideas that I might have been previously closed off to that I suddenly realized were quite important. You know, I personally talk about my own resistance to thinking about gender or identifying as feminist in any way, precisely because of the way that it sort of, when I was studying, pigeonholed people into focusing only on women's issues. And, you know, for me, as a conflict analyst, the stuff that interested me was the kind of militarized societies, which tend to be quite militarized masculinities in those societies. And I didn't want to just focus on women's issues. And one of the things I say about gender is it's not just about women, you know, it's about relations between genders, of thinking about how power relations are framed from a gendered perspective. But that took me a lot of time, you know, it took me many years to come to that understanding of gender. And I try and do this River of Life to show, you know, what changed my mind, what shaped my views, and to also make students feel comfortable with the idea that at some point, you know, I didn't know about this stuff. At some point, I was quite resistant to certain ideas, which are now kind of fundamental to my understanding. And I hope that kind of inspires students to feel okay with not knowing and okay with being a bit uncomfortable or changing their mind. I think sometimes the view of academia is that you need to be definitive and certain, and you need to argue your position assertively, and you can't say I don't know. But actually that's really not what learning is about. You know, it is about saying I don't know, I need to learn, or I'm not sure. So the river of life is really a way to get students to understand that they've made that journey their whole lives as well, and that they're still on that journey, and that I'm still on that journey. And to also make students feel that it's okay to, you know, have an opinion that might not be, you know, considered appropriate right now, that might be changed later.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, in the book, I talk a lot about unlearning, but also being comfortable with ambiguity. So there being more than one answers to a question, or big questions not having any answers, or definitely no easy solutions. And how do you feel the students are kind of taking that on board and learning from that? Because sometimes they do want answers. They want us to tell them, you know, what development is all about and how it works. So how kind of in your experience do students then learn from these more open-ended and creative approaches?
I mean, I think the way that they sort of learn is by this constant questioning. So obviously in my gender courses, we deal a lot with this idea of patriarchy, which a lot of people think they know about, you know, and particularly around this idea that patriarchy is a system where men hold relative positions of power compared to women. You know, there is resistance and pushback to that, often, you know, from, well, not just from men, from women as well, who could point out to a whole range of men who they don't believe have privilege, you know, and are suffering at the hands of various systems. And from that, you know, we then take the question, okay, all right, so then why, who is benefiting from patriarchy? Okay, if we take the very valid point that not all men benefit from patriarchy, what does that tell you about patriarchy as a system? So why, your point is valid, but why is that a defense of patriarchy? If actually no one is benefiting, then surely that's even more reason to think about dismantling that system. So, you know, it's really about taking on your initial reactions and your initial examples you can give that kind of counter maybe some of the issues we're dealing with, and you know, you can find exceptions to all these kinds of arguments, and then asking yourself, okay, so why then are we thinking about this as a system that should be upheld? And how does it interact with other systems? So if we think about something like gender, how does that interact with race or class, or related issues of cis privilege or heteronormativity? So it says, okay, there's a lot to think about. We can't isolate something in its own little bubble, because if you do, you can point out to lots of exceptions. So that's more reason to bring in other analytical frames and think about other issues. And then what do you want to do with that? Do you want to point out that there is power everywhere and we need to analyze things in relation to power, and think about how those power relations can be redistributed, or how we can uplift people who are oppressed by that power? And so it is really important, I think, at the beginning of a class to think, what is it we want to achieve? You know, what is it that underpins what we're trying to achieve? And then the debate happens within there, you know. So we start a class, I say, like, we have to be motivated here by ideas of justice and equality. And if we're not interested in issues of justice and equality, then we don't have a common ground on which we're sort of studying. And I think the students are quite open to that, because I say, you know, if we open it up wider than that, if we're not interested in justice and equality at the heart of what we're learning, I'm not sure what I can teach you in this course. But if we are interested in issues of justice and equality, and that's the end goal we want to get to, then there's a lot to teach. So it's about both narrowing the parameters to focus on something specific, but also then widening the lenses at which we look at that. Yeah, so I think we kind of want to ask our students, what do you hope to achieve as your kind of end goal? And for me, in teaching the courses, for me, it's about justice and equality, and how we can achieve the most just and equal society that we can. And, you know, there's debates within that about what we mean by justice and what we mean by equality, and we have those debates within the classroom. But I do like to set a kind of parameter of where that debate happens. So in my Building Peace After War module, I start by looking at a spectrum, and I say, if we are going to have a very wide spectrum, we can have, on the one hand, you have this world, the kind of Hobbesian world of a war of all against all, where everyone is selfish and out for themselves, and violence takes place because everyone is fighting everyone. And then on the other hand, you have this kind of utopia where everyone's maximum potential is fulfilled and they have this life of justice, and any kind of tension is resolved in a perfectly fair and just way. And then sort of in the middle of that, if you were going to argue to the middle of those two extremes, you have a world where you accept that, you know, violence will happen and people will be maximizing their own interests, but you instill some kinds of mechanisms in which to manage that so that it doesn't end up with everyone killing everyone. And the thing is, if we argue to the middle, then that's just the world we have now. So there's not really much to teach the students if we're trying to argue to the middle, because they can just look around them and then go home, you know. So I say, what is this course trying to do? It actually starts at that middle. That's the world we have now. And we're actually moving towards that utopia. And that utopia is not something that can be easily achieved. There's no clear way in which to achieve it. So the debate lies in, how do we create these mechanisms? How do we create these understandings, these norms, these values and beliefs that can push us towards, you know, acting in solidarity towards each other, and not necessarily being self-serving, and working out ways to distribute power and resources in ways that are the most fair and just. And if we set that utopia as the goal, then we have really interesting debates about how the world can be better, if not perfect. Whereas if we are just arguing to the middle, we'll just end up with what we've got right now.
I love your use of the word utopia, because one of the things I write about quite a bit is critical hope. And I think, you know, you started with that. So it's a perfect way to bring us back to the idea of teaching students critical understanding, but finding ways to I don't know, nurture or keep alive their critical hope in that things need to get and can get better.
Yeah. And I think it is that thing of keeping the hope alive that things can get better, and not feeling so hopeless that you just want to give up, but also then not feeling so complacent and saying, you know, the world is better than it was 50 years ago, so let's just stop, kind of thing as well.
Yeah.